let's talk about Apple's Scary Fast event and the new M3 Max. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. Coming right on the heel of Apple's Scary Fast event, there's a lot of thoughts that I have, but before we go on, I'd like to say a big thanks to those of you who have already subscribed to the channel. Much appreciate having you on this journey with me. If you're new to the channel, please make sure you subscribe. That's the one way to really help out the channel, and hit on the bell. This way, when I release these performance benchmark, you'll get a chance to see them pretty much right away. And if you find information that I'm sharing with you in this video or any future videos or past videos on this channel helpful, please consider using a link to the tip jar or YouTube Super Thanks. All the funding that you give me will go into support this channel and also hardware purchases to do all these testing. All right, with that being said, the first thing that I like to comment on is the cadence. So we recently just have the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro in the M2 machine earlier this year in late January. And now we have these machines coming out. This has been about, I would say, 8 to 9 months or so. Granted, Apple wanted to release the M2 generation around this time last year, but that didn't happen. The timing got pushed back. So personally, being that I purchased the M2 machine and I am using one right now, I do feel a little bit upset that the cadence was not a little bit longer, but I feel that this is going to be the timing that we're going to get these machines now. They're going to be on a yearly release cycle because innovation comes that fast to Apple, and now they're in control of the full stack from literally the silicon to the OS. So they're always going to be releasing something new, and that's just something that we just have to get used to. Now, for a majority of us, I would probably say that we're not going to be upgrading every generation and it won't even matter that much. But to me, because I'm doing all these type of machine reviews, comparison, and benchmark, it is something that I'm always thinking of in the back of my mind. In the presentation, a couple of things that I note right away is that they were really comparing these new M3 machines to the Intel generation. So what they're really trying to do is push away the Intel generation and also telling Apple Intel user that, hey, you know what? It is time to upgrade your machine because our machine is double or more than 10 times the performance of like the Intel generation. I mean, simply put, from the M1 generation, it was already easily beating out the Intel one. This one is just going to make it further leap apart than the Intel Mac that have come before. And I'm really looking forward to really see the performance improvement in this series. So interestingly enough, on Apple website, when you look at these computers on the page, for example, it says, mind-blowing, head-turning, not a lot of the scary themes that are being shown during the event, or like, for example, monster performance. We don't see a lot of those in here, which is, you know, a little bit nice. So this is going to be something that lasts past Halloween as well. All right, a couple of the other things that I note here is that the 13-inch MacBook Pro has been discontinued, is no longer being manufactured, and Apple have lumped that chip into the 14-inch machine. So now the 14-inch have the regular M3, M3 Pro, and M3 Max. Very interesting there that they're pretty much bumping the Pro machine up and including them into the 14-inch lineup. I think it cleans up the lineup a little bit and it makes it a little bit less of a comparison between like, should you get this machine, should you get that machine. Also, the 13-inch has the previous generation design with a touch bar. It's good for that machine to really go away. A couple of thoughts that I have on the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro is that it has a slightly brighter SDR. This is standard dynamic range display, and that is 100 nits more, so about 20% brighter. I mean, chances are if you're using this in normal, like bright daylight condition, it will probably be more of a benefit for you. If you're doing this in a pro workflow inside a studio, very light control environment, that 100 nits might not do much at all. Now, the other thing to note as well is that the sustained maximum nits and the max nits are still pretty much the same as the previous generation. So we're looking at sustained at 1000 nits. At the max peak, you're looking around 1600 nits. So that specs has remained the same. Now, I've also made a calibration guide, which is that video right there, the ultimate 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro with XDR display calibration guide, which also works for Apple Pro Display XDR and Apple 27-inch 5K Studio display as well. So I highly recommend that you check that out. Now, my thing is this. Because there is a new GPU architecture, which we're going to talk about in a moment, I'm hoping that Apple didn't really change the way how the graphic layering is happening on the system and the graphic output are being handled. Because when Apple moved over to the M1, there was a big change coming from Intel to M1, and the calibration software didn't work for quite some time. When Apple moved over to the M2 generation, the Pro and the Max did run into a little bit of those issues, and I was really working on the back end with Calibration to get all those issues resolved and fixed as fast as possible, which they did, and that was a really great thing. But fingers crossed, hopefully that everything will remain the same, that when we get the machine on day one, everything will just works right out of the box, especially for calibration. So I'll be running those tests as well. Now, the other thing that I also want to point out is that on the 14-inch model, I mentioned this already, there are 3 variations. There's the M3, M3 Pro, and M3 Max. And on all of this, I mean, there are a few variations as well. The 14-inch have the most SoC varieties that you can choose from. 1 M3, 2 M3 Pro, and 2 M3 Max. When it comes to the 16-inch, you really have the Pro and the Max, and there's only 1 Pro SoC and 2 Max SoC in the lineup. So something interesting to note there. Now, the other thing, as I've been chatting with one of my friends, Kevin, and he pointed this out to me that, you know, the CPU, it's not just the CPU, there is a performance and the efficiency core. And this is something I always look at because it's a metrics that I always use to gauge some of the performance, because a lot of times, for instance, when I'm running Lightroom Classic, doing the preview, doing export, it would really attack more of these performance core rather than efficiency one. Now, what's interesting in this generation of M3, and you're really only going to find this information out when you really click on tech specs, you're going to see that there are, in general, less performance core and also more efficiency core in this generation. So what this is telling me is a couple things. Number one, the performance core are getting much more powerful, so Apple is scaling those down and using the performance gain from it, and also the 3 nanometer process for fabrication to really gain on that chip. So technically having less in this regard, and also a even more high performance efficiency core that's up to 50% faster than before. And what they're really trying to do is using these two to really blend in and increase the overall performance and efficiency overall in the system. Now, whether this really translate into the photo app that we use, we're gonna see, because I have these machines on order and we're definitely gonna be testing them out. So that's the one thing that I definitely want to point out. There is definitely less performance core, but hopefully the speed gain will definitely improve that, and also the efficiency core will make up for the difference in those, and also the more, I would say, efficient and also powerful efficiency core as well. So this is really pointing out to one big advantage of Mac over the PC, and I think the M3 generation are going to push it even further, because I just recently ran a test with a Razer Blade 18 laptop, and one of the comments I forgot to mention in that video was the fact that the Razer Blade was plugged in the whole entire time that I ran various tests on that machine. It was never at any given point in time running on just battery. The nice thing about these Macs M1, M2, and also M3 generation is that, and this is also something they said in the presentation, I have tested this out and this is true, I can run it with the power on, meaning that it's plugged in, or I can run it on battery and the performance is the same. This is something that you don't really get on the PC side of things, and Mac is further pulling away from PC in this regard. These new M3 SoC also comes with next-gen GPU that has dynamic caching, so it's still using unified memory on the system. However, depending on how much the memory is needed for the GPU on each specific application that you're running, the system can dynamically allocate the memory to those GPU. How this is going to really translate into real-world performance in Lightroom Classic, for example, image export with GPU, or for example, Capture One export that just utilizes GPU fully, is something that we're definitely going to be testing out and seeing if we're going to reach the plateau again with Capture One or not. Because Capture One, there is definitely a point of diminishing return when it comes to more GPU. It doesn't mean the program is going to run any faster. Now, whether this memory allocation is going to change it or not is something that I'm definitely going to be really curious about. They also mentioned during the presentation that these new SoCs also have faster NPU, that is the neural processing engine. It's still 16 cores, but I'm also going to say this, that some apps do go in and use this now. For example, Topaz does run a lot of the processes the AI itself on this engine, this neural processing engine. But, you know, even as it is filming Sonoma 14.1, Lightroom Classic 13.0.1, Adobe is still using GPU to render the AI noise reduction in Lightroom Classic. Part of this is because there were some error that happens when you use NPU that causes some artifacting to happen, some colors to change, and you know, the experience can vary, but I know that those are some of the issues that they're still working out right now. And I also know that DxO Pure Raw is running into this very same issue as well, so they're not really using NPU just yet. So hopefully, even though this is a faster NPU, the system can really go in and utilize it more, and these bugs are really resolved out. Now, if you know if DxO is already using, for instance, NPU, do let me know in the comments below. We'd love to hear that. The other thing I also want to point out, and my friend pointed this out too, is that the memory bandwidth does vary. For example, with the M3, you're looking at about 100. The M3 Pro, you're looking at about 150. M3 Max, you have two variations. One of them is 300, the other one's 400. And the main question is, does this really matter? The answer to this is no. There's another point that I'm going to make later on in this video that I'm going to bring up now, and that is pretty much that these machines are way more powerful than the application that we have today to really go in and saturate all the memory bandwidth. So it really doesn't matter that much at all. I've demonstrated this in even the M1 generation. Now, coming from the M1 to the M3 generation, there are architecture improvements, but have our app really improved that much to really go in to saturate all the memory bandwidth? The answer to that is no. Because these chips are just pretty much leaps ahead in terms of performance, a lot of times these programs, the apps that are running, the creative app, are just sending the signal to the computer, and we're just using brute force to processing these data. That's really what it really comes down to at the end of the day. So the memory bandwidth will not matter much at all because, again, like I said, most pro app right now does not really go in and saturate, for example, the CPU, the GPU, the NPU all at one given single time and really utilize all of those. At most is really utilizing, for example, CPU and GPU together, or one of those combination, and then it pause for a little bit and go use NPU. It's not using all of those three simultaneously, but it's good to have that extra headroom. So far, we still haven't really gone in anywhere close to maximizing that headroom on Apple Silicon yet, not even in the M1 generation. So, that being said, this chip also has the media engine. Apple didn't say anything about the media engine, whether they are faster or not, so I will be curious to see if, for instance, in the M3 and M3 Pro, is this running the same as the previous generation or is it a little bit faster? And if you do any type of video work, I highly recommend getting the Max. The reason why is because doubling the media engine, meaning that it's going to cut down your time that you need to render the files and everything else that you need to output the video by quite significantly, like in half. So I highly recommend Max if you're doing a lot of video. Now let's quickly talk about upgrade option because the path can be kind of rather interesting. When it comes to the M3, you don't really have a choice for silicon. You just have the different memory option, and it goes up to 24 gigabytes, very similar to the M2 generation chips. So that's very similar, and you only have the choice to, for instance, choose the storage and also the power adapter, and storage still goes up to 2 terabyte max. Now, if you need anything more than that, well, then you would have to go into and start to look at the Pro SoC. Now, when it comes to the Pro, this is now where you're going to see a lot of options. And I'm choosing the 14-inch one because the 14-inch has the M3, it has the M3 Pro and also the M3 Max. And when it comes to the M3 Pro and the 14-inch, you can choose two variations. So there's the one with 11 CPU, 14 GPU, and another one that's $200 more that has 12-core CPU and 18-core GPU. Now, is this $200 going to be a huge improvement? My guess is that we're going to see a slight bump in performance, but whether it is $200 worthy or not, chances are it's going to be very similar to the M2 generation where I say, well, it's not really that much worth it. What I think is more compelling is the memory option on these. So the memory, you have to start out with 18, so this been bumped up from 16 gigabytes. And if you, for instance, choose the M3 Pro, the maximum memory you can still choose is 36. So even though you upgrade the chip on the Pro itself, you're maxed out at 36 gigabyte memory. So if you're looking to get any type of memory or like any higher, you need to go into the Max SoC. Now, when we start to jump into the Max, we start to see a couple of options pop up. So our baseline is 36, which is rather interesting. And the next option up for the base Max SoC here with 30 GPU and 14 CPU is pretty much 96 gigabytes memory. There's no doubling, for instance, the 36 one. So the only option that you have is to really go in at around 2.6 times more memory, which is what you get right there. Now, if you want the other option, to access the other memory, you have to choose the M3 Max, the top performance one, 16-core CPU, 40-core GPU. This way you can access 48 gigabytes of memory, 64 option, and also 128, and you're also skipping the 96. This has a lot to do with the number of GPU that they have on the system and everything, and I find this rather interesting. So on the Pro 14-inch, you can still go up to 8 terabytes of storage, although that does really command a large sum of money. So a couple of things to note here. This is very similar to the 14-inch model as well. For instance, if you go from the top Pro to the base Max, you get 2 more CPU, you get 12 more GPU, and even though it's $400 more, you also get double the amount of memory as well. So going from 18 to 36. So that's something to consider there. Now, if you go to the top performance spec one, you do get a few more things. So for example, you get 2 more CPU core and also 10 more GPU, and your memory gets bumped up from the 36 one to 48 gigabytes of memory. So you do gain the extra 12 gigabytes of memory on the system as well for that $300. I think that these are offering a lot of really compelling options for you to really think about if you're going to upgrade your system. Now, the main question is, do you need all those extra GPU in the system or not? That's going to be the thing. And the other thing that I also want to point out as well, that what's different between the M1 Pro, M1 Max, M2 Pro, M2 Max generation coming to the M3 is that when it comes to, for example, M1 and M2 gen, once you reach the max amount of CPU core in the system, it pretty much remains the same between the Pro and the Max. Where in this generation, Apple's now creating a tier, not just only in the GPU variation, but also in the CPU variation on the system as well. So that's going to be something to really note. I'm going to think that's going to be very interesting because they're also increasing the number of performance and also efficiency core in each a little bit differently as well. So we'll see how that performs overall. And like I said, the memory are a little bit wonky in terms of how you would go and upgrade it, but those would be the pathway to do that. So, right. So a couple other speculation I have is that the 512 gigabytes is probably going to be on a single NAND chip. So it's probably going to be a little bit slower. If you want anything faster, I highly recommend going with a 1 terabyte on the system. If that is something that matters in your workflow at all, let me simply put it this way. If you're constantly pushing your computer through a lot of like difficult workflow with multiple apps running, constantly swapping to your disk, you're probably choosing your computer with a larger SSD to start out with already. All right, so let's do a quick round with my pro advice. So start out with this. My recommendation for any Pro out there is to look at the 14-inch one as a good starting point, but don't go with the M3, go with the M3 Pro or the M3 Max. That's going to be a much better performance machine. And the price variation between these two, when you start to configure things at close to an equivalent level, you're really looking at prices that are really not far off from each other. And you do get a bit more of performance from the CPU itself or from the SoC. So I highly recommend going with the Pro or higher, especially if you're doing this for any type of Pro workflow. So like I said, the CPU core counts are not the same this time around. I mentioned that already. Max, I think, offers a pretty good bump in value, although going from, I would say, the Pro to the Max also is giving you something more than just, for example, more GPU. It's giving you more memory, and it's also giving you an extra CPU core as well. So something to think about there. Don't worry about the memory bandwidth in terms of the interchange speed, how fast they are. It's really not going to equivocate itself to that much difference in real world workflow. Don't worry too much about SSD speed. And if you're really concerned about that, configure your machine with at least 1 terabyte. If that is something that you're really going to be like worried about, chances are it's going to be similar to the previous generation that can already read and write at around 3,000 megabytes per second or higher, which is probably more than enough for any real world application that you put it through. So it's going to be fine. Unified memory architecture now has GPU with dynamic caching. We're going to see how that performs. I'm really looking forward to that. It works differently, yes, but also the other thing that I want to mention about this unified memory architecture is that it is not a magical unicorn. And I hear a lot of people saying this, and I think it's a misconception that, oh yeah, it's unified memory, it works differently. Less is more. I'm like, less is not more, less is less. So if your apps need the amount of memory, just go in and put in the money to upgrade the memory in your system, because because, for instance, you're going to still run out of memory on this machine. It's not that you can really push, for example, for an 8 GB machine and expect to work with Photoshop and Lightroom running multitasking and also Safari running without running out of memory. That's not going to happen. You're still going to run into these issues. And if you're a pro, my recommendation is to go and configure a machine with at least 16 GB of memory, or the next round up to that number, whatever that may be, whether it's 18 or something, or even go in and upgrade your memory to even more memory than that. You're going to really benefit from it, and I highly recommend that. So a couple of other suggestions I have is that if you are going to upgrade your machine frequently, I highly recommend looking at one of the stock configuration. Don't really go in and put a lot of money into upgrading all these components. If you are going to update a little bit less frequently and you keep your machine long term, my recommendation is to really go in and just configure the machine that you need to take on the road, and just don't look at the next generation come out, because the features may not change much. It probably will be incrementally faster, but it's not going to make the biggest change in the world. But if you need a machine that's going to function the way how you want it right away, and you're not always upgrading, I would just say go and configure the machine that you want right now. So a couple of other things I also want to mention as well is that the SoC upgrade, going from one, for example, the M2 Pro bumping up by one, or the M2 Max bumping up, might not be as worthwhile as you think, depending on how the app is utilizing that. I'm going to try my best to get many of those machines in to do a comparison, but it may be somewhat limited because, I mean, again, these machines are really, they command a pretty premium price tag. One more thing that I want to cover is the choice between a 14 versus 16-inch laptop. My advice to that is just choose the size that works best for your workflow. Personally, for me, if I'm configuring a machine, and I am configuring this, I am getting the M3 Max inside the 14-inch chassis. Yes, when you run, for instance, a lot of applications, next to a 16-inch one, the 14-inch fan is going to go off. But guess what? This is much lighter for me to really carry on the road with a lot of gear that I have, and it's a much more portable laptop. And I was able to take this machine and work on the road without any problem whatsoever. So if portability is your thing, if carrying less weight is your thing, I highly recommend going with the 14. But don't worry so much about getting the 14-inch. If it's going to throttle or anything like that, it's going to happen. It's just pretty much physics, so that the chip doesn't burn out. But you're going to get a machine that is going to work best for your needs and workflow. And if you're going to use a machine that you may go out on location every now and then, but it's mostly going to sit on your desk as a semi-desktop machine, then choose a 16-inch one. But choose the machine that is best suited for your size, and don't worry if something is going to slow down or not. It's just the nature of physics on this. There's less heat dissipation. Fan's going to run a little bit harder on here. I face this all the time, and I'm okay with it. But for the most part, it just really just hums silently, unlike a PC that I have actually tested on my channel. All right. Couple other things I want to share is that I have retested every computer that I have, including borrow some of my friends to do testing as well. So when you take a look at the result that I'm comparing for you guys, you're going to see fresh new result, not historical data. So everything has been retested in all the apps, and we get a chance to really see how the M1 and M2 generation SoC are performing with different OS and also different software versions as well. For example, Lightroom Classic, Lightroom is running a little bit slower. Capture One rendering preview is a little bit faster, but only on some machines and not on like the top spec machine one. A couple other things is that the GPU export on Capture One is a little bit slower on these current generation OS and the current app version. So these are just some things to really think about. I mean, there's a lot of things that really get added into the OS, and being able to test the operating system and also the app in the current version rather than using historical data is also something that's really important to see as well, because then we get to see trends. So like I said, I might release a preliminary video result of those in a few days or so. So another thing I wanted to mention as well, some people have commented on my video saying, aren't you really biased about the result because you're still using Nikon D850 RAW file? My answer to this is, what I'm going to do in the videos that I release is I'll show you some reference on a faster machine with different RAW files. For example, 1,000 RAW files from a Z9, 1,000 RAW files, for example, from a 61 megapixel Sony A7R5. So I'm going to show you some of those so that you get an idea as far as how much the variation are. But for the most part, I've run those tests already. The variations are only a few minutes apart at best, meaning that the newer files does take a little bit longer. But because I'm keeping all this group of files really consistent throughout the entire generation, this is really showing me the trends of the machine, and I can share this trend with you as well, as far as Is the app running faster? Is the app running slower? Is this improvement on the silicon really what we're really seeing on the silicon, or is this something that we're really seeing on the software side of things? So all these answers, by keeping those set of test file consistent, is telling us a lot. And these are not small JPEG. They're still 45 megapixel raw files. So that's something that I want to mention there. So I'd rather keep things consistent. Now, I can't test every single configuration, but if any of you are local in SoCal and you want to loan me your machine to run some tests, by all means, please reach out. I would love to just, have your machine for maybe about 4 or 5 hours to run the test. That would be great. And lastly, a video on the iMac test will probably come later on, if it does come at all, because it still also has the M3 chip on the inside, which I think we're really going to see how the M3 it's going to perform in the 14-inch one, and it's going to be very similar on a desktop machine. So I really don't see a lot of point really going through testing that machine out. But if there is something specific that you want to see in an iMac, do let me know. I might consider getting one into the studio to really do some testing for you guys. So keep me posted on that one if you'd like to see something on the iMac. Anyway, this has been a fairly long video. Like I said, hopefully I'll see you maybe once or twice before all the testing machine comes in the following week. So fingers crossed, we'll see where this takes us. But anyway, if you have any questions or comment, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you're new, and in Art we trust.